Hi, I'm Elaine Engelhardt from Utah Valley State, and welcome to class, Ethics and Values. In our last class period, we talked about Thomas Hobbes and looked at his theories around rights and convention. Today, we're going to move on to another very important philosopher, Immanuel Kant. And helping me with this discussion is Dr. Michael Shaw. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much.
Glad to have you here with us.
It's nice to be here.
I'll introduce the students, and then I'll have you tell us just a little bit about yourself. So I'll come back to you. Over here, we have Rhonda and Cassie. And over here, we have Lloyd and John. And didn't really divide it up according to gender, but that's how it worked out. So Michael, tell us a little bit about yourself.
I received my PhD from Villanova University in Philadelphia, and I specialize in ancient Greek philosophy. And I also have an area of competence, as we say, in modern philosophy, which includes Kant.
Well, very good. And in teaching this ethics and values class, it seems that all of us in the philosophy department enjoy teaching ethics. We enjoy getting to know all of the philosophers. Tell me a little bit about your experiences in teaching the class.
I enjoy teaching the class very much. I find the students are very interested in the material and that they enjoy working on it, enjoy talking about the ideas. My style of teaching is to focus on the ethical theories themselves as the bulk of the course. So I really attempt to engage the students in the thought of each of these philosophers as much as possible. And I think that by the end of the semester they appreciate learning the way that these people think about ethics, morality, and the like.
Oh, very good. Well, we've got students who are going to be watching us as they're taking this distance. So hopefully by engaging the students here in the studio, we're also helping to engage the students who are watching this on their broadcast. So thank you very much for joining us. And we're going to pull you right into Immanuel Kant. How do your students respond when you tell them we're going to be discussing Kant today?
They respond fine when I tell them we're going to be discussing Kant until they've read it.
Until they've read it.
Yeah.
And then what happens?
Then it's books flying across the room, hair being torn out. He writes a little densely.
Okay, so you students who are watching this from your homes, you'll find this, that Kant does write a little densely, but once you read it and then reread it and probably reread it and reread it.
I tell my students not even to try if they don't read it twice.
Yeah.
For Kant, reading twice is just essential.
It is. And another hint that I give my students when they're reading it is that maybe you'll find that Kant will explain a point and he'll go this far, then he goes back and he picks up everything from that point and makes the next point. Then he goes back and explains everything that's been made up to that point and makes the next point. He's a logician and he doesn't want to have any holes in his theory. And so when you figure out how to read Kant, he's actually very enjoyable and one of our more logical writers. So now I can read Kant quite quickly, but I do remember as a student reading Kant about 4 pages an hour.
That's about right. And I might recommend a dictionary as well, because he'll use some vocabulary that many students probably aren't familiar with off the bat.
Very good.
So.
Yeah. Any of you students want to tell me some of your either favorite points about Kant or your stories in struggling through and learning Kant? How about it, John?
I know that Kant was born and raised in the same city and never left that city almost his entire life. And he was so meticulous about his time schedule that people at the university that he worked with could actually set their watches to when he would pass a certain window at the school, and they knew that he was going to pass. And he was just very meticulous about his time schedule, which I think works into the fact that he was a brilliant logician in some ways. I think it kind of fed itself into his personality a little bit. Yeah,
you know, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but he grew up in East Prussia in a town called Königsberg, and he didn't travel very far from home, but people would certainly come to his classroom and did set his schedule. You know, he was in class by 7 and having lunch and then discussing things with friends, had a walk every day at 4 o'clock. And do you think he was married, Lloyd?
No.
No.
That's one thing that's interesting with Kant. He's one of those, you could call like those professors, guys, intellectuals sitting in their white ivory towers who just think by themselves. And that's one thing that's interesting about his philosophy. As you read it, you can tell that he's just trying to use himself. not trying to go to any other sources, but trying to think everything through his mind himself. And so he was, at least from my understanding, he wasn't very social and everything, because he just tried to keep to himself, to just sit in his room all day long and try to figure things out.
Okay, very good. And he's writing in the late 1700s. He's writing this work. And Rhonda, can you tell us from which of his works our reading for today was taken?
Sure. It's the Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals.
Okay, and what are a couple of the other books that our introduction tells us he published?
Well, he also wrote The Critique of Practical Reason in 1788, and in 1790 he wrote The Critique of Judgment.
Okay, and Mike, he was a philosopher who was a logician, and he really enjoyed doing metaphysics, and he liked math.
And astronomy.
And astronomy, a true interdisciplinarian. And by studying all these laws of nature, he kept thinking, there have to be moral laws too. So if I ask some of you students, what is a law of nature? Cassie, what would you say is a law of nature?
There's a cause and effect to everything, a reaction to everything.
Okay, inertia?
Yeah.
How about it, Lloyd? What's another one?
Just law of nature, just pretty much how science works. So
How science, gravity.
Yeah, gravity, all
Okay,
that.
how about if you don't eat, what happens, John?
You starve.
Starve to death.
Yeah. So you have to eat to survive. Another
Yeah,
law of
and
nature.
he's thinking, why can't we have some moral laws that are just as strong as those physical laws? And Rhonda, do you think it's possible?
Yeah, it is. It is possible. You would also, though, in some of those possibilities, have to really discipline yourself.
Okay, that's what he expected. He expected a lot of discipline, and he expected perfection, and he expected by today we'd be a perfect society. I mean, that we would follow what he said, and we'd probably be pretty good folks.
If we followed what he said.
If we followed what he said. So, Mike, tell me a few thoughts about Kant and his grounding and how he comes about with this philosophy.
Well, there's much to say about Kant, so I'll keep it as brief as I can. The way that the example of cause and effect as a law of nature is a very good way to understand Kant, I think. Kant will argue that we can never learn cause and effect perfectly by observing nature, but that cause and effect are actually what he calls a priori ideas, which is to say an innate idea, something that we're born with or is somehow present in our mind or soul before we learn anything.
Now, this is so important, Mike, because he brings up a posteriori and a priori. So go ahead and tell us both of these.
Well, so a priori means, most literally, it's a Latin term that means before experience, and a posteriori means after experience. And so Kant will say that if everything we know about cause and effect comes after experience, we can never be certain that the next time we experience an event, it will happen exactly the same way. So to have perfect knowledge of nature, there actually have to be these a priori innate ideas that we're born with that we then almost force nature, or the appearances of nature, to conform to. So we have these ideas in our mind, sensible impressions enter our mind, and we organize the impressions according to the innate ideas that we're basically born with. So the important thing here is that our knowledge of metaphysical laws of nature doesn't come exactly from experience, but rather comes from reflecting into our own consciousness how we must experience the world. And he wants the same thing with morality.
Oh, okay, very good. Now, Rhonda, you're representing the student, the average student who is taking this class by TV. Do you have some questions for Dr. Shah before we move on from this point that he just made? Because this is a very complex point.
Yeah, basically, when it comes to a person's goodwill, can you define for that what that means?
For Kant?
Yes.
Yes, certainly. Kant will argue that the human will can be affected by two different principles, either our inclinations, which are to say our desires and our wants, or pure reason. Pure reason can tell our will how it should act. And for Kant, a good will is a will that is determined entirely by pure reason, completely independently of any desire or inclination that you may have. And so to act according to a good will is not to say, I want to do good for people, and I have this desire to do good for people, and that's why I'm going to act this way. But for Kant, to act according to a good will is just to say, what does reason by itself command, independently of what I may or may not want. And that will be a purely good will, one that is determined entirely by reason. And for Kant, that's going to be a will that's completely determined a priori, or independently of experience, because of course all your desires and your inclinations come from your experiences in the world.
Very good example. And we will be spending more time on the goodwill and notions of the goodwill. Anything else, Lloyd, that you might want to add to this discussion of a priori and a posteriori?
I think it's a huge distinction there that needs to be made, because that's what really Kant, all of Kant's philosophy is this trying to figure out what he can know with his mind alone and not based on experiences of the world and everything. So that's really important. I mean, that's all his, like I said, all his philosophy goes with that, and so it's especially important to know while studying his morals, because that's exactly the same thing he does here.
Okay. Just another piece to understand Kant just a little bit more before we move on to this reading, Mike, is Kant is born into a family that is religious, a pietist, but he's also born into the Enlightenment. And so he's trying to come up with a philosophy where he does not have to say, this is a divine command reasoning, that we're doing something not because God said so,
Right.
but because of pure practical reason.
That's right.
Coming down to reasons around the goodwill and other concepts that we'll be looking at. Any ideas that you can give us on this, on Kant, his background with religion, and the Enlightenment? What was going on at this time?
Well, with the Enlightenment, philosophers were starting to discover that human reason by itself, or at least at that time they believed more fully perhaps than some do now, that human reason by itself can discover absolute truth with respect to nature, with respect to morality. And so what many theologians and philosophers argued had to be accepted on faith, divine religious commands and things like that, Kant is going to argue we can understand these things with the rational faculties of our mind as well. And I think it's important to understand that even though it's not a divine command theory, Kant's morality will be completely consistent with what a divine command theory would tell you to do, at least in the Christian conception of a divine command. So Jesus, for Kant, acted according to a completely good will, but from the outside, we can't tell whether it was this pure will or his own inclinations and desires that were causing him to act in this way. And so we can never be certain, but everything that Kant's categorical imperative, we haven't gotten there yet, Kant's morality will demand is going to be the same thing that a traditional conception of Christianity would demand as well, but for a different reason.
And it's fine for you to say categorical imperative, because that's what the reading's about, and that's going to be a test question, several test questions. So we'll be moving on into that too. Do you have any questions from Dr. Shah, Mike, on what's going on then in the Enlightenment? And do you think maybe even that Kant might have been censored or worried about being censored because he wasn't writing purely religious divine command theory, but he was kind of getting around it? I've heard some scholars say they think maybe he was being censored, or he had to write more densely because he worried he might be censored.
It was a problem in the modern period of philosophy. John, were you answering there? Do you have anything to say?
Not right now. I will.
So, Descartes faces similar critiques that he might not say exactly what he means because he's worried about religious persecution for emphasizing the rational powers of thought over faith. I think it's a debatable point, and my personal sense is that Descartes, and writing in the late 1500s, was under, or maybe later than that, early 1600s, was under much more pressure than Kant was in the late 1700s. And so I actually don't think Kant was very worried about religious pressure or political pressure. I think he wrote that way because that's actually just how he wrote. And that's how he thought.
Okay, no excuses on this.
But I think that it is certainly a point that scholars debate. Some people think Kant was under pressure, some people think he wasn't. And I probably fall on that he wasn't under any real pressure side of things, but that's just opinion.
Okay. Yes, Rhonda.
One of the difficulties that I had when I was learning to read Kant was the fact that Kant is a very black and white person. I had tried to make him more human, with other feelings like we would typically think. And Lloyd had taught me that, no, he just is black and white. Would you agree with that?
Well, that's a very, very hard question, actually. I think that with respect to what we're doing with Kant's ethics here, that he will come across as a very black and white thinker. There is absolute right and there is absolute wrong.
Right.
And the moral law demands that you act a certain way in every time you come up with the same ethical dilemma. So there is no room for error. There are no circumstances that would allow you to break the ethical law because of overwhelming pressures that really could be justified. Kant won't allow for that. As you get deeper into his thought, it becomes more problematic, but I think that moves beyond what we're looking at.
It does, but if any students do have questions about this, I think you should always go back to the notion that he is a rationalist and an absolutist, and that will be how he'll ground his theory.
Is
Yes,
there
John.
any debate over whether or not he's supporting a Christian ethic? I mean, isn't it, ultimately that's what he's doing? I mean, is there any debate over that?
I think there's a little bit of a debate in that he's trying to also break free from it. So certainly there is, as Michael said, beautifully said, he has a Christian background and everything could be consistent with Jesus Christ's teachings of Christianity. But I think that his goal is to move away from it, to say we can have a system of behaving morally without having to resort to God told you to do this. That as a human being, you can think this through with pure practical reason and do what you ought to do. So I think Kant would say, please give me credit for being a true deontologist.
Yes.
And that's going to be our first big word, John, and I'm going to have you read it for us. So let's go ahead and pull up that first graphic, and this is going to be a definition here then of Kant's work. So would you read that?
Right, law, duty, conscience, obligation, virtue. Acts rightness lie in motive, virtuousness, or fulfillment of moral law, regardless of consequences.
Okay. Who wants to tell us just a little bit more about this very important word that encompasses our reading for today? I guess that leaves it up to you, Mike. Or I
We can
do
give them
it.
a little more time to answer.
Oh, okay.
No, I'll be happy to. Deontology comes from the Greek word. Deon means duty, and so it's the logos or the study of duty. So deontology, as John pointed out, basically means duty-based ethics. There's an absolute right and wrong, as we pointed out earlier. So a deontological ethical theory is one that says there are certain absolute commands that you must follow, that you can never break them under any circumstances. Yet for Kant, it's not the same thing as we talked about earlier as well as divine command theory, because we are learning what these commands are according to our own rational exercises and inquiries.
Very good. And you remember on our first day of class that we talked about the different ethics systems that we would be studying in this class, and we started out with duties, followed by rights, utility, virtue, and we'd be examining an emerging ethic based on relationship. So Kant is clearly in our duty category, and our duty philosopher will be looking at. And as we move on into this, then we jump right on into this concept of a good will. And Lloyd, would you read for us this concept of a good will?
Sure. Nothing can possibly be conceived in the world or even out of it which can be called good without qualification except a good will. A good will appears to constitute the indispensable condition even of being worthy of happiness. A good will is good not because of what it performs or affects, not by its aptness for the attainment of some proposed end, but simply by virtue of the volition that it is. It is good in itself.
Okay, and then he's going to follow up and say it's good in itself, and on page 27, second paragraph, he says, a man's will is good not because of the consequences that flow from it are good, nor because it is capable of attaining the end which it seeks, but it is good in itself because it wills the good. So what does that mean to you, John, when you hear these definitions?
I think what Kant's kind of trying to say is that the intent behind an action is what is good or isn't good. And the consequences and the effects of that have no bearing on whether or not the intent itself is good. And so he's speaking specifically about the intent and about nothing else really. That's what I get out of it anyway.
Okay. And Cassie, this is such an important principle. Tell me how you could help a student engage in this point.
How, me personally, how I could?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that, yeah, understanding what will means in this sense really helps, and that it is the intent, the pure intent behind the action, before the action, and not any of the causes of the action. I think that's something to keep in mind.
Okay.
The use of the word will.
Okay. And he takes quite a while as he unpacks this notion of the goodwill. But if you had a student who wrote you an email, who came into your office and said, I don't understand goodwill, could you explain it to me? Can you imagine doing that by email?
Perhaps.
Yeah, it would be a long email.
It would be a long email.
Longer than the reading.
If you students have questions about goodwill, it's probably best if you just gave me a call or came into the office to either visit me or one of the students, one of the teaching assistants that I have there, because it can be a rather complicated point.
Right. This is what I was speaking about earlier, where when you think of the will, you think of the power of choice that a human being has. So a good will is a human being that chooses properly. And as I said earlier for Kant, there are two things that can affect our choice, our desires or pure reason. And so if you let pure reason determine how you will act in every situation, that's a good will. And as John pointed out, it doesn't matter if you succeed. You can intend to act well and screw it up when you go into practice. And for Kant, that's more moral than doing a very good deed because you had some secret selfish motive that made you do this good deed. It's much better to act for the right reason and fail than act for the wrong reason and succeed.
How about that? I'm really hungry, Mike. I really want a hamburger, and I don't have any money, and I don't know when I'm going to get any money. But I say, hey, Mike, will you loan me enough money to get lunch today? And I'll pay you back. But, you know, man, I don't know when I'm going to have money to pay you back. And, you know, we see each other in a few days, and I'm kind of embarrassed. And how does this tie into the goodwill? Because I'm not going to get around to paying you back, I
Right.
don't think. I mean, I may have really intended when I was really hungry to pay you back. But
I think that that's exactly the right example to go to. A goodwill, as we will talk about maybe at the end of this episode or the next class period, a goodwill demands that you have certain laws that determine your moral behavior that you always follow without exception. And part of what Kant's ethical theory will prohibit is lying. And so there is never a good reason to lie. There is never a justified reason to lie. You can take it even a step farther than you have. It could be you are caring for starving children, and if you don't lie to me about being able to pay me back, you won't be able to feed your starving children. And Kant will still say it's never okay to lie. It's always unethical to lie. The reason doesn't matter. The motive doesn't matter. That's taking your desires into account, and Kant's ethics won't allow for that.
no, they won't. If I make a promise, I need to keep my promise.
That's
right.
right.
If I borrow the money and say I promise I'll pay it back, I need to pay it back.
That's right. And what you should say is, I am starving, I can't pay you back. Can you please give me money?
Okay.
That's how Kant will say you need to handle this situation.
Very good. Lloyd, you had your hand up, and
Oh, I was
is the
going to
point
say-
still relevant with goodwill?
Yeah, well, Mike basically made this point, and it's kind of going along with John said. While intent's important, and one of Kant's big things is the intention has to be towards the law. And so even if you intend something good to happen, that doesn't really quite matter as much as you intend to keep the law, which we'll explain later what these laws are. But so your intentions aren't necessarily related to the results, but your intentions are to that law, to the rules that you're supposed to follow.
Okay.
Yeah,
and
that's very well put, I think.
it is. It's very good. And in fact, let's read this next graphic. And Lloyd, would you read that for us and see how it ties in?
Sure. Even if it should happen that, owing to special disfavor of fortune, this will should wholly lack power to accomplish its purpose, if with its greatest efforts it should yet achieve nothing, and there should remain only the good will, then, like a jewel, it would still shine by its own light as a thing which has its whole value in itself. Its usefulness or fruitlessness can neither add nor take away anything from this value.
Okay, tell me just a little bit more about that in connection with your comment.
Well, he's just basically saying here that if we have a good will, if we have the right intent to follow the law, even if bad results happen because of that, or good results, or whatever results happen, that doesn't change anything as long as, because the goodwill was intending to follow the law.
Okay, thank you. Do you have a question, John?
In a way, is Kant kind of assuming that there are actions that are purely altruistic, that it's possible to act in such a way that there is no selfish, ulterior motives to any action? In a way, is he assuming that?
He does. In fact, let me give you 3 examples, and let's decide which one involves the goodwill. So I just got back from Washington, D.C., and there are a lot of people on the street, panhandlers, asking for money. And so I'm walking with a friend, and I see this panhandler, and I want my friend to respect me, so I give the panhandler some money. Okay, now example number 2. So I'm walking down the street, there's a panhandler, I'm with my friend. I don't necessarily want to give this panhandler money, but I do. I think I ought to, and I do. And then third thing, I'm walking down the street, I see the panhandler, and I think, man, I'm going to feel so guilty if I don't give it to him. I'm going to feel so good if I do give it to him. I'm going to give him the money, and so I do. Now, we have 3 examples of giving money to a panhandler, but which one might include my goodwill? What do you think, Cassie?
The second.
Okay, and why would the second?
It's, just based on what you ought to do, what is duty-based. And
Okay, even if I don't want to do it, I feel like it's my duty.
right.
Okay. Comments on this, Mike?
Yeah, another great question from John, and I don't know that we have to say that you actually take all of your own personal desires, or you can not even think about them or not have, maybe that's a better way to put it. It's not that you can ever not have these desires, it's that you don't take them into consideration when making your moral choice. So they're going to be there, and you might want to do X or Y for your own personal needs, even if those personal needs are just helping everybody out. That's still a personal desire. But it's when you make that moral choice, you sort of push those to the side, and instead you just say, what would the law command? So it's not that you don't have the desires, it's that you try not to consider them. You just consider what the law demands. That's all.
And this is a perfect segue into our next graphic. So Rhonda, could you read our next graphic on duty?
Duty is the obligation to act from reverence for law.
Where are we starting?
Thank you very much, Rhonda. And Cassie, how would you take this definition of duty and tie it to the goodwill?
Well, basically, the goodwill is just acting in reverence for the law. So when you have goodwill, you're acting in reverence for the law. So when you have goodwill, you're doing duty, or you're fulfilling the duty.
Okay, so now let's do Kant's trick, Lloyd, where he gives us a couple of little pieces and then goes back and pulls in some more. So now we have these notions of a priori and a posteriori. We have a definition of duty and also a definition of goodwill. How are you going to tie those together for us?
Well, like we said before, for Kant, he doesn't want to base anything off experience or base anything off of our experience with the world per se. And so the a posteriori aspect, he's just kind of wants to set aside. So he wants to look at everything a priori. He wants to look at, okay, what can we figure out from reason alone? And so by doing that, he's going to want to develop a law and that comes out of reason alone. And so that intent, that goodwill is all going to have to be pointed to these laws and duties and whatnot we could pull out of our minds by itself without any experiences, without guesswork of what might happen if we do this or that. It's all going to be coming from the mind.
Okay. And Mike, can you help us pull, on top of all this concept of our natural inclinations, and where does natural inclinations come in with the goodwill and duty?
That is a difficult question. Our natural inclinations will be oriented towards the self-preservation of the individual as well as the species. And oftentimes that will conflict with duty. And this is a real problem in Kant's philosophy, the fact that Kant makes an argument that nature doesn't do things in vain. So if nature gave us reason and made reason practical, which means practical reason means reason is capable of determining action or practice. So because reason can determine how we act, nature must have intended for reason to determine how we act. Yet nature also gave us natural inclinations, which can determine our actions. So we have these conflicting principles pulling on our minds or on our souls, telling us sometimes to do opposite things. Reason demands that we follow a law. Inclination will demand that we satisfy our desires or help our friends or family, and those may conflict with each other. Kant actually will argue that this was part of nature's intention so that we can become self-aware of the rational powers of our mind. Because reason is in conflict with our inclinations, our natural desires, that makes it possible for us to reflect on the fact that we have these competing principles, and makes us inquire into what it would mean for reason all by itself to determine our action. And Kant calls this a natural dialectic, whereby our natural inclinations and reason conflict with each other, and this helps us discover what pure reason determining the will would mean.
All right. And
was that what you were asking?
Oh, absolutely. And John, why is it so important that we find this pure practical reason in determining the will?
Because it's the only way that we can act in reverence to the law in some way. We have to have that practical reason in order to act in reverence to the law.
Okay. So you have to have reverence for the moral law, and that's going to be our definition of duty then, acting in reverence for moral law.
I see this with children.
Uh-huh.
Children have the natural inclination to get what they need or what they desire. If they go into a store and you're checking out and all you see is all the candy, a child may just, take the candy because that's what they want. But the law says that we don't steal.
Right.
And so later we have to teach that child, or as we grow, we have to, push down some of our own natural inclinations in order to get along.
Okay.
I think that's actually an excellent example.
It is.
And I think for Kant, it's almost like humanity as a whole is in a kind of childhood, because we, just like the child can't follow the law but acts according to our desires, for Kant, almost by the time he's written this, pretty much every person who's ever acted is acting according to their desires and not following this pure moral law that he thinks he's discovering. And so I think part of Kant's ethics, or part of his own purpose, is to raise humanity from out of this childhood-like state into a more mature adulthood of ethical behavior.
I think that's a wonderful way to look at it. And for you students, this discussion is taking place on page 28, first column. And you'll find here where he says that we need to have, because the only thing which I can reverence for, or which can lay me under an obligation to act, is the law which is connected with my will, not as a consequence, but as a principle which is not dependent upon natural inclination, but overmasters it, or at least allows it to have no influence whatsoever in determining my course of action. And continues later on, almost to the bottom of the page, where he says that we need to, every object of the will, nothing else is left, which the will can be determined, but objectively the law itself, and subjectively pure reverence for the law as a principle of action. So he's asking for pure reverence for the law as a principle of action. Mm-hmm. So he's asking you, please use your pure rational justification in making these decisions, and then have reverence for that. Anything you'd like to add to that, Mike?
I think you've said most everything very well. That gets back to the question that John asked: how do you take your own internal desires and motives out of the question for Kant's ethics? Well, you make respecting the law the principle behind your action, and that's why it's still personal to you. But you say, I'm not going to worry about my own needs and in my own circumstances of my life if I want to be moral. I'm just going to say, what does the law command? And that will be my own personal principle of action, following the law.
And now he's going to give you a formula to help you do this. So now we're moving just a little bit further in this, and let's look at his first proposition of morality. And would you go ahead and read this for us, Rhonda?
The first proposition of morality: a duty that is not from inclination has moral worth. To do good work when we can is a duty, and besides this, there are many minds so sympathetically constituted that without any other motive of vanity or self-interest, they find a pleasure in spreading joy around them, and can take delight in the satisfaction of others so far as it is their own work.
Okay, so Mike, our first proposition of morality then is that duty that is not from inclination has moral worth, and then we give an explanation of it. Do you want to unpack this just a little bit more for us?
Sure. First, I would say that students in the class should pay attention to this episode for the first proposition of morality, because Kant doesn't develop it so clearly in the reading. I think he just thinks that it's self-evident or something from his complicated writing beforehand. But a good example that he uses is the case of somebody who might desire to commit suicide to help explain this proposition of morality. So if life is going very well for you, and you follow the moral law which says don't kill yourself, it doesn't necessarily have moral worth, because you may be acting from your own self-interest, which says, hey, life is great, I like living, I'm going to keep living. So it's not necessarily the case that that duty is based on following the law, but rather that duty of preserving your life is based upon your own inclination. So Kant tells us duty that is not from inclination has moral worth. And so Kant uses the example of an individual whose life is going horribly and has no promise for any happiness ever again. If they don't kill themselves, they can't be preserving their life out of inclination, because all their inclinations say, whoa, life is terrible, I better get out of this. That individual who preserves their life when there is no inclination to do so must be acting out of respect for the law. And so from the outside, that is the only way we can tell that that individual is acting from duty, and therefore that their actions have moral worth. This is an important point. Just to say quickly, part of the problem with Kant's ethics is we can never be sure what another individual's secret motivations for action are. And so we can't know why somebody is preserving their life, if things are going well or poorly for them. So Kant is trying to use the example, if we're looking at someone from the outside, we can see that their life is in a very poor situation, and yet they still preserve their life. We can tell that they must be acting from duty rather than from out of inclination. And that's what it means to say an action has moral worth, that you don't follow your inclination, but rather you just simply act according to duty.
Very good. And in your reading, you will find this example where he does talk about it and preserving your own life. Actually, a topic that can be written regarding Kant is suicide. But the good explanation just came from Dr. Shaw, so thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. And Lloyd, would you like to add to this?
I just have a question. Can somebody be inclined, or can somebody do something out of duty and still enjoy it, or does it have to be done grudgingly?
That's a great question.
It is.
I think you can do something out of duty and still enjoy it. I think what Kant is looking at with this example of suicide in the reading is a little more oriented towards us trying to be able to tell from the outside what somebody's secret motivations are. And so if an individual is enjoying their lives and still preserves their life, we don't know why they're preserving their life. Is it out of just this respect for the law that every moral individual would have for Kant, or is it out of inclination and the desire for happiness? The individual could know inside that they are respecting the law and they are also enjoying this. But us looking at the outside, we can never be sure what secret motivations are. And so I think Kant is using this example of the individual who preserves their life when everything is just terrible for them as a sort of a clear-cut case. We can say, look, in this case, inclination isn't even relevant, so we know they're acting from out of duty. But you can also act out of duty even if your inclinations tell you to do exactly the same thing. And I think a good society and a good moral individual, that would be the case most of the time in their lives. Their inclinations would be in perfect accord with what duty commanded, and that would be both a moral existence and a happy existence. Sometimes you'll have conflicts between the two.
Oh, I like the question and the answer.
Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and unpack just a little bit more this first proposition of morality. And Cassie, would you read this for us, please?
But I maintain that in such a case, an action of this kind, however proper, however amiable it may be, has nevertheless no true moral worth, but is on a level with other inclinations. For the maxim lacks the moral import, namely that such actions be done from duty, not from inclination.
And could you continue on, please?
It is in this manner, undoubtedly, that we are to understand those passages of Scripture in which we are commanded to love our neighbor, even our enemy. For love, as affection, cannot be commanded, but beneficence, thank you, for duty's sake may. This is practical love, and not pathological, a love that is seated in the will, and not in the propensities of feeling, in principles of action, and not of tender sympathy. And it is this love alone which can be commanded.
Okay, so maybe we can use this example of Jesus Christ and the type of love that we have here. And maybe also we can use another example that will help also pull us into his second proposition of morality. And let's say that you have a married couple, and they are not happily married, but they stay together. And their inclinations would certainly be to live apart, but they've made a promise and they stay together. You have another married couple who are very happily married. Everything's going great, things are wonderful, and they want to stay married. So where does this fit in with our first proposition of morality?
Well, I think it is certainly possible that both couples are acting out of duty. But I think what Kant's getting at here is, in order to tell, again, from our position from the outside, the couple that is happily married may just be acting according to inclinations. They might not even have any knowledge of what the moral law is or what duty requires. They're still following duty, what duty would require, but that's not the reason that they're doing it. So it's the motivation, that internal principle that is off for them. The couple that is unhappily married, there it's easier for us to say, well, the only reason they're staying together is because of duty.
Okay, and that's where he's going to say they have moral worth. They understand, they have reverence for this moral law. They understand they made a promise, they keep this promise. We're not going to get into psychology and effects on children or
Right.
anything like that.
That's another problem.
Yes, that's another problem. But Kant would say then that this couple, they would be doing the right thing. They're doing what they ought.
And the reason that they're doing it, if they're unhappily married, Kant will say, must be out of respect for the law, because their inclinations would tell them that they shouldn't be married. The law tells them that they must remain married. The first couple may be acting out of respect for the law, but I think Kant wants to say it doesn't have moral worth in this context because we can't be sure. We can't distinguish whether it's the law or inclination that's motivating their actions.
Okay, very good. Any other questions on this first proposition of morality? Well then, let's go ahead and move into the second proposition of morality. And John, would you read that for us?
Yes. Duty's moral worth lies in the principle of the will without regards to the ends which can be attained by the action.
And let's continue on with the next one.
An action done from duty derives its moral worth not from the purpose which is to be attained by it, but from the maxim by which it is determined.
Okay, Lloyd, we got a big word there, maxim. You have any idea what it means? You're going to get out the dictionary for us?
Well, maxim is basically the law,
Okay.
the rule that you need to follow.
All right. Any other words that need to be added to that maxim? So it's your subjective principle of volition, perhaps, or
Something like that, yeah.
Okay.
Well,
John?
For Kant, the maxim is a universal law. So it's not just something, a law for yourself, or individuals have laws. For Kant, what a maxim is, a true maxim, is a universal law that everyone is supposed to follow.
And I think
Okay.
Lloyd is exactly right. I would distinguish, for Kant, a maxim is a true universal law in the sense that, according to Kant's ethics, the maxim should be one that is a universal law. Exactly as Lloyd is pointing out, many individuals, criminals and the like, will have maxims that are not universal laws. So a Kantian maxim, the way he sees it, is exactly how Lloyd described.
Okay.
But in a more broad sense, a maxim can be, a maxim is, as you pointed out, is a subjective principle of volition. So it's like the reason why you do what you do.
Okay.
And if you're going to be moral, that maxim better be acting out of respect for a law, for Kant.
Okay. And so if we're going to look at what John just read for us, then he says, a duty's moral worth lies in the principle of the will without regards to the ends which can be attained by the action.
Yeah.
So we're not going to look at the ends. Why is this so important that we're not going to look at the ends?
Well, for Kant, you can see this is a very clear case. In his philosophy, his moral philosophy, it is not the case that the ends justify the means. That does
Okay.
not happen for Kant. You cannot make a few sacrifices to get to a good end, because those few sacrifices would not be universalizable in the way that we'll discuss shortly, and they would therefore be immoral. So this goes back to something that I think we also discussed a little bit earlier. The idea is that it's not the goals of your action, the ends and the goals and the purposes of your action, who you're going to help, what you're going to do. Those are not relevant to morality. As Lloyd pointed out, all that's relevant to morality is that your maxim be in accordance with law. And that means you're going to act this way because the law the moral law demands that you act this way. And if you achieve your goals, good. If you don't achieve your goals, it's still moral.
Okay.
Well, and that law has to be all-inclusive for everyone.
Yes, that's right.
So, for instance, the law says you don't kill.
That's right.
That includes everybody. The opposite of that would have to be everyone kill.
Right.
It has to be one or the other.
And before we move on to that point, which is very complicated, go ahead, Cassie,
I was
and then
just
I'll ask
gonna
you another
say,
question.
And we're not supposed to really focus much about the goals or the consequences because this is supposed to be based on a priori before experience. So,
How did you know that's what I was going to ask you?
Oh, I
didn't. Because
but if you would have asked me, I would have blanked. But
Because as we talked about in a class period a few times ago, we said we have consequentialist ethics and non-consequentialist ethics. And we can clearly see then this is a non-consequentialist ethic. And why is that so?
well, he's not concerned with the consequences because it's not based on experience. He might not have had much experience staying in the same town his whole life, not being married in his white ivory tower, like Lloyd said, but it's a priori before experience.
Okay, and then Rhonda's moving you now into universalizability. So do you want to?
Sorry, I jumped the gun there.
That's all right. No,
Would you
we
like
can
me
go.
to talk
Yes,
about
let's
that?
go ahead and talk about that.
To say something is universalizable, as Rhonda pointed out, is to meet what it's kind of in Kant's ethics. It's basically it's make believe or pretend to try to just keep really what's going on here. To universalize in Kant's language, you universalize a maxim, which means you take your own principle of action, what you're doing. So, for example, you may lie because you're hungry. And so to universalize that, what if anytime somebody needed something, they were to lie? And that's what universalizing means. You say, what if everybody in a similar situation to me acted in exactly the same way I'm acting right now? That's what it means to universalize it, to say that everybody acts in exactly the same way in the same circumstances. So for Kant, if everybody were to lie, nobody would ever believe a promise. And therefore, you wouldn't get the money from me for the hamburger. And so that's why lying's fundamentally wrong, not exactly because it's evil or immoral or something like that. It is immoral, but the way that you tell whether it's immoral is not because you're being mean to people, but because you can't universalize that maxim into a consistent law that if everybody acted in the same way, society would work just fine. Kant's going to say if everybody lied, nobody would ever believe a promise, and so society couldn't operate according to lying as being a universal law, because you'd basically, in universalizing your lying, you almost demand that nobody believe you. And so your will, in Kant's language, contradicts itself instantly.
Okay, your will is contradicting itself. Very good. And John?
So does Kant make any way for different situations? Like, say there's a situation where it's necessary to lie so that you can survive, so that you can eat. I mean, if there's a situation where it's absolutely necessary that you lie in order to survive, does Kant ever make way for that? Or is it one way all the time? You cannot lie, period.
I think he'd find a problem with your logic, because quite often people will use this example with Kant of the Nazi soldiers coming to your door and saying, "Are you hiding children?"
Yes.
And Kant's going to say, "Yes, I'm going to say I have children." But he said, "You will always know I'm going to tell the truth. You can be prepared that when they come to the house, you better be running." But he said, you can count on me. Another interesting thing he said is, well, you'll have to get past me first.
Right.
But he's going to say, don't try to put me into that corner, because he's going to say, look at the other way. If you can always count on me to tell the truth, that you can universalize this, then we could even have a perfect society where nobody would be yelling. Nobody would be lying, and we wouldn't have Nazi soldiers yelling, let us in to find these children, because that's such an immoral thought in and of itself. Nazi soldiers killing innocent Jewish children. So.
Yeah. So, I think Elaine's right on. And John, I think the answer to your question is Kant's morality does not allow for exceptions. Now you may say, look, in this case I don't want to be moral, according to Kant's ethics, and that's your decision. But Kant's morality will allow for no exceptions under any circumstances, at least how I read it. I think along the same lines, war can never possibly be moral for Kant. That doesn't mean that war is not necessary for Kant, and I do believe Kant thinks that war is actually another component to humanity, that while it's sort of a necessary evil that is helping us advance, what he says specifically with respect towards constructing international laws, but murder or killing is never, ever, ever justified. So I think in Kant's mind, there's no such thing as a moral or a just war. War might be necessary for every single society, and that's something you can't avoid, but that doesn't make it moral. And so you do start to get the sense that Kant's ethics is pointing us towards almost a utopian existence, where in the perfect society you could act morally all the time without any negative consequences. In the real world, perfect moral action may involve a great deal of self-sacrifice.
And you know, that's where I think that you can say Kant has a lot of love in his philosophy.
Yeah, I think so too.
Do you? Yeah. A lot of people say, oh, Kant, he's an old fuddy-duddy, and he doesn't understand love. But I think this is his concept of love. So it's not a romantic love, but it is.
It's a rational love.
It is a rational love. Well, we're just about finished with our class period, but we need to move on to the third proposition of morality. And Lloyd, would you read this for us?
Sure. Duty is a necessity of acting from respect for the law.
Okay, and let's move for the next one as well.
Now, an action done from duty must wholly exclude the influence of inclination, and with it every object of the will, so that nothing remains which can determine the will except objectively the law, and subjectively pure reason, pure respect for this practical law, and consequently the maxim that I should follow this law, even to the thwarting of all my inclinations.
Okay, so this is our third proposition of morality, and it sounds strangely like the first and second. So he's just moving a little bit, starting over, moving a little more, and starting over and moving a little more. So you students, when you're reading this, just make sure that you understand that Kant is reiterating some points for you so that you can clearly see where he's moving with this. So where is this third proposition adding? What have we added in this third proposition, Dr. Shaw?
Well, I think that what we've added Kant argues that the three propositions of morality the third is derived from the second is derived from the first. Mm-hmm. So we're sort of taking the concepts in the first two propositions of morality and spelling out the conclusion, which turns out to be a definition of duty. And so duty is defined as the necessity of acting from respect for the law. So we finally get a definition of duty, which is a word that Kant's been using without defining it in the reading so far. And it also tells us that what duty is, as we've spoken of earlier, is to disregard your inclinations or your desires and to follow only the law, whatever that, we don't know what the law says yet, but whatever, because it's not the law of society, it's the moral law that he's looking for. And duty will be to follow that moral law and nothing else.
And Mike is exactly right on that. It'll be a test question because it's so important. Now that we have this definition of duty, it will be on your exam. So duty is the necessity of acting from respect for moral law. And it's also going to be in your packet, so make sure that you have that there. And we have one last definition to look at, and it was a question I asked Lloyd earlier, but let's look at the definition and see also how maxim then does tie in to our first, second, and third propositions of morality. And can you read this for us, Rhonda?
Yes. A maxim is the subjective principle of action and must be distinguished from the objective principle, namely practical law. The former contains the practical rule set by reason according to the conditions of the subject, often its ignorance or its inclinations, so that it is the principle on which the subject acts. But the law is the objective principle valid for every rational being and is the principle which it ought to act, that is, an imperative.
Okay, so Mike, now we've pulled in an extra word. First we had subjective, now we've got objective. Tell us a little bit about what an objective rule is.
An
objective principle.
A subjective principle will be one that holds just for you as an individual subject. It's just true for you. An objective principle is something that holds for everybody.
Okay, and so how does this tie into our definition of the maxim then?
Well, A maxim is a subjective principle of action. So a maxim is actually subjective rather than being objective. It's what are you going to do and why are you going to do it with respect to a moral action. I think for Kant, you need to make your own subjective principle something that could hold objectively for everybody.
Okay, that this is something that everyone ought to do.
That's right. And so that's the difference between a moral maxim and an immoral maxim. A moral maxim is one where you take your own personal motivation and you say, I'm going to make sure that my motivation or my principle of action is perfectly consistent with an objective law as if everybody had to act in exactly the same way I'm acting right now, that could happen. If you don't do that, then you're not acting morally.
Okay, thanks. And Lloyd, I've been using this old-fashioned word ought in this class period. Why is ought a Kantian word?
Ought, it's just, like he says imperative at the very end of that definition there. An imperative or ought, should, I mean, that's really what morality is when we're talking about this, is you're trying to say what someone ought, what someone should do, how someone should behave.
Okay, so this is an imperative, and an imperative is what we ought to do.
Yeah.
Okay, we made it through the first half of Kant. And in our next class period, we're going to have Dr. Shaw's wife, Dr. Shannon Mussett, here to help us finish up Kant. So it's fun to have the team, and they are just such an excellent couple. They're both brilliant philosophers and wonderful colleagues and good people to the community, and I just couldn't be more appreciative of you being here with our class today, Mike.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And I think we'll see you in a couple of other class periods, well, definitely Aristotle. So, and hope that you students were all feeling more comfortable with Kant. And as Mike and I mentioned in the beginning, if you're not, watch this class period again and then read it a couple more times. And then certainly you can come in and visit myself or the teaching assistants, call on the phone. The email will be a little tricky. Thanks. Bye-bye.